Well, hi everybody, it's me, Mitch. I talk a lot about sous vide. It's a French word, S-O-U-S-V-I-D-E. Literally translated, it means in a vacuum. It's a cooking method. It's a cooking method that uses a machine called an immersion circulator. This is an immersion circulator. This one's made by Innova. And what this gadget does is it sets down in a container, clips on to the edge of the container, and that container can be anything that holds water. It can be a pot like this, and the immersion circulator would simply set down in the pot and you clamp it on the outside. Or it can be something that's dedicated, that's manufactured to be specifically for use with an immersion circulator. These are available. There's a number of different kinds of them. I'm going to show you one here. It's the one that I use. And then we'll talk about how this works, what it does, how you can use it, and why, in my estimation, it is the absolute best way to cook pretty much any kind of meat, especially steaks. This is a container made for sous vide. It's got a snap-on lid and a tub full of water. Comes with a rack, and the rack goes down in the water like this. The purpose of the rack is to hold a steak that's been vacuum sealed, like this one, in a bag, and you want to make sure you use a BPA-free bag. These WeVac bags that I got with my new immersion circulator work great for this. You could take these things right out of the freezer and just put them right into the immersion circulator, and the rack is designed to hold them down so that they're completely under the water. I'm going to put the flap on this side so that it doesn't get in the way of the circulating water. Now, you don't need to even take the lid off to put the meat in, because the front hinges up, and that's how you can put the meat in to the container. The actual immersion circulator itself just sets right down and you clamp it on. You don't need to clamp it too tight, but that keeps it in place. And what it does is it heats the water through the heating coils in the base of this thing to a precise temperature. Just like when you're cooking a steak, you know that if you cook it to 125 to 130 degrees internal temperature, it's going to be medium rare. If you get it up to about 135 degrees, it's going to be less rare, all the way up to 150 or 160 degrees where it's well done. The beauty of these things is if you set this for 128 degrees like I do, and you put the steak in it, you cannot heat that steak up to more than 128 degrees, even if it sat in there all day. You can't overcook it. It will bring the temperature of the meat up to the temperature of the water around the vacuum sealed bag, and that ensures that it's perfectly done. Perfectly done. So, let me demonstrate how this thing works and show you a few variations on it. All right, let's see how this thing works. I'm going to go ahead and plug it in, and it'll turn itself on. Talks to you. And it tells me the temperature of the water inside now is 76.6 degrees. Now, up at the top here, I've got a few buttons. This button here on the far right allows me to set the time, and I can set it in 5-minute increments with the plus and minus buttons, or I can hold the plus key down and it'll set it an hour at a time. So let's say I want this thing to cook at 2 hours. I can set the temperature 128, 129, and I want it at exactly 128 degrees. And then I'm going to just press this button that says go. Now, the circulator starts and it'll start to heat up. And any time between now and the time it gets to temperature, you can put the meat in it. So, all we need to do, lift the lid, push the meat down in the rack and make sure it's completely underwater, close the lid, and we are all set. I'm going to leave this in there because this steak is going to be my dinner tonight, and I'm just going to let it cook. It'll take about 20 minutes to heat up. At that point, the timer will start, and it'll count down 2 hours. So in about 2 hours and 20 minutes, this steak will be ready to take out of the water bath, sear it off for maybe a minute aside, and I do that in a carbon steel pan. And I've got the best steak. Now this steak happens to be an odd shaped piece. It was cut at an angle for some reason. Maybe that's why I got it on sale. One edge of this steak is 2 inches thick. 2 inches. The other is about 1.25 inches. To try to cook that thing properly in a frying pan would mean that the 2-inch thick side would probably be raw inside, where the thinner side would be getting well done. This solves that problem completely. It doesn't matter how thick or what shape the meat is. It's going to stay in that water bath long enough for that entire piece of meat to be cooked up to, in this case, 128 degrees. It will be evenly done throughout. It's another great advantage of sous vide. And if it's a huge, thick piece of meat, you might leave it in for 3 hours or 4 hours. It doesn't matter. You cannot overcook it. I can't emphasize enough what a great way this is. Now, if you don't have a vacuum sealer, there's another way of putting something into this immersion circulator that'll keep it in a vacuum. And they call that the Immersion Method. And if you're really concerned and you're one of these people that just absolutely wants to make sure that there's going to be no plastics coming off of the bag, which is highly unlikely in 130-degree water with a BPA-free bag, but if that bothers you or you're worried about it, you can get a food-safe silicone bag like this that's made specifically for sous vide, and you put the food, and for sake of this demonstration, I'm going to take the steak plastic bag and all and stick it in the silicone bag here. I guarantee it's easier without the plastic on it. You turn it sideways so that it hangs down in the bag, and then when you lower this bag into the water will push all of the air out of the bag from around the food, as long as the top of the bag is open and above the water. So we will push this all the way down into there, And now, as long as this bag stays above the water line, there is absolutely no air in that bag. The pressure has pushed all the air out of the bag, and then you just lay the bag like this. You don't have to snap the lid down. And then you start the cooker for however many hours and whatever temperature that you want to set it at. And it will go ahead and completely bring the temperature of that meat or whatever's in the bag up to the exact temperature within 1/10 of a degree. And that's the key. You can't do this with something that heats water up hotter or the meat will get hotter. You don't want the meat to get not a degree hotter than what you set it at, and that absolutely guarantees a perfect doneness inside the meat. Generally, it takes about 2 hours, but if you happen to forget about it and 4 hours goes by, doesn't matter. If you leave it in there for 8 hours or a whole day, probably still be okay. In fact, with really tough cuts of meat, what we do is cook them for 24, 48, 72 hours like a chuck roast in here. And it tenderizes the meat as well. But when you take it out, it's perfectly cooked to whatever temperature was set on the immersion circulator. These things are not that expensive. And if you're a carnivore and you're cooking meat all the time, especially expensive meat like ribeyes, New York strips, there's no better way to ensure that you get a perfect steak every time. And I've done some videos and showed you just how well it comes out. There's no work to set this up. You just put the meat, either vacuum seal it in a bag, you can salt it first if you want, you can put butter in the bag, you can put anything in the bag that you might want to infuse into the meat under vacuum. Heat it up in the immersion circulator, sous vide it for a couple hours, unattended. You don't have to worry about it. I'm not going to get into it, but this thing also connects to an app on your cell phone. So if anywhere around your house, you can just look and see how much cooking time is left from the time you set and exactly what the temperature of the water is. I hardly ever use that. You don't have to monitor it. You set the temperature, you turn it on, you hear the little motor run, it starts circulating the water around in the tub, and voila. You pull it out of here, and as you've seen in the videos that I've done, you just heat up and I use carbon steel. I like carbon steel to sear these things. Put a little butter or bacon grease in the pan, sear it up super hot on the outside, and I'm telling you, there is absolutely no better way to make a steak. If you don't want to buy a dedicated container like this, you don't want to buy a rack to hold it down, you can use any old inexpensive pot like this. You can push it down in the water and use a clip to clip the bag onto the outside edge of the container, and that'll hold it in place as long as it stays under the water. The meat stays under the water and there's no air in the bag or water in the bag around the meat. The meat will not stew, it won't be boiled, it will be just evenly heated to whatever the temperature, and in my case, it's for a steak, it's always 128 degrees, and I always get, without fail, a perfect doneness, tremendously juicy and flavorful steak. Now, I've got links to all of these little pieces and parts. This particular ANOVA immersion circulator, the tub that comes with the rack, the silicone bags. If you don't want to use plastic or you don't have a vacuum sealer, this works fine. I don't recommend using the Ziploc bags because you don't know if they're BPA free. But the silicone bag is perfectly safe. And that's all you need. With that, I'll let my steak cook. You've already seen me sear them off, so we'll end this video here. If you have any questions about sous vide, Something you still don't understand? Put them in the comments below. And with that, take the rest of the day off and eat meat.